The Spanish moss, those macabre drapes resembling funeral shrouds, hung heavy and still from the ancient oaks that marked the path to the gallows. Even the humid Louisiana air seemed to mourn, clinging to the skin like a shroud itself, as if weeping for the tragedy about to unfold. Marie Laveau, not the celebrated voodoo queen of New Orleans, the woman whose name echoed through the city's shadowed alleys, but a woman who merely shared that name and its accompanying, potent gifts, stood with the other enslaved people, forced to bear witness to the execution of my son, Baptiste, barely 14 years of age. His transgression? The theft of a single, solitary apple from Master Bogard's meticulously cultivated orchard, a paradise of fruit denied to those who toiled to bring it to life. A crime deemed unforgivable by 13 men, 13 arbiters of life and death. Master Claude Bogard himself, a man whose corpulence spoke of stolen labor and whose brow glistened with the sweat of self-importance, delivered the sentence. His words were clipped, detached, delivered with the same indifference one might use to swat a bothersome mosquito. 12 overseers, each a pillar of Bogard's twisted kingdom, nodded their assent, their faces betraying a perverse satisfaction, the glint of cruel joy that comes from wielding absolute power over the helpless. 13 souls who had collectively decreed that a child's life held less value than a piece of fruit. Let this be a lesson, Master Bogard bellowed, his voice a thunderclap across the assembled throng, echoing with the hollow pronouncements of a corrupt deity. Let it be a lesson to every slave on this plantation. Theft will not be tolerated. It matters not the age of the thief, nor the value of the stolen item. Property is property, and those who violate the rights of property owners must face the consequences. Baptiste stood on the rough-hewn gallows platform, his small frame outlined against the oppressive sky. His hands were bound tight behind him, the coarse rope cutting into his wrists. Yet, his young face shone with a dignity that transcended his fear, a pure innocence confronting the gathered malevolence head-on. He had taken the apple not for himself, not out of selfish hunger, but for his younger sister, Celeste. My sweet Celeste, who had been battling a fever for 3 long, agonizing days, unable to keep down even a spoonful of broth. Fruit, with its sweet, life-giving juice, was the only thing she craved, the only thing her parched throat could accept. But explanations were useless, futile offerings to men who viewed enslaved people as mere livestock, beasts of burden, rather than human beings with beating hearts, with families and feelings, with hopes and dreams that mirrored their own. "Mama," Baptiste called out, his voice surprisingly clear and strong despite the palpable terror that must have been clawing at his insides. "Take care of Celeste. Tell her I love her. Tell her the apple was sweet." Those were the last words my son would ever utter. The trap door sprung open with a sickening thud beneath his feet, and the rope snapped taut, breaking his young neck with a sharp, brutal sound, like the splitting of dry kindling. My beautiful boy, my firstborn child, the light of my life, the very air I breathed, was dead at the tender age of 14, murdered in cold blood by 13 men who had so thoroughly deluded themselves into believing that his life held no value, no consequence. But they were profoundly mistaken about the worth of his life, and they were about to discover, in the most agonizing way possible, just how catastrophically wrong they were. As I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching my son's lifeless body swing in the stifling humidity, listening to the self-satisfied murmurs of the 13 men who had so casually orchestrated his demise, feeling the crushing weight of grief and rage settling into my very bones, a tangible presence threatening to consume me whole, I began to meticulously plan their destruction with the cold, calculated precision of a master artisan. I was Marie Laveau, daughter of Marie Laveau, granddaughter of Marie Laveau, a lineage of women who had carried the ancient knowledge of our African ancestors across the vast and unforgiving ocean, and through generations of enslavement that had relentlessly sought to strip us of our humanity, to erase our heritage, to silence our voices. The power that coursed through my veins was older than slavery itself, older than America, older than the Christian God that Master Bogard so readily claimed had granted him dominion over other human beings. The 13 men who had murdered my son had no inkling of what they had unleashed. They saw me as just another grieving slave woman, broken and powerless, condemned to accept their judgment and carry on with my life as if nothing of significance had occurred. But they had never encountered the unbridled fury of a mother whose child had been unjustly stolen from her. They had never faced the wrath of a woman who commanded forces that their limited comprehension could not even begin to grasp, forces that lurked just beyond the veil of their perceived reality. As the crowd began to disperse, the overseers herding the enslaved people back towards their meager quarters like cattle to the pen, I remained standing beneath the gallows, where my son's body still hung suspended, a grotesque parody of freedom. I reached up, my fingers trembling, and gently touched his cold, lifeless foot, feeling the warmth that was already beginning to dissipate from his flesh, and I made a solemn vow, a promise etched in blood and bone, that would shake the very foundations of the Bogard plantation and bring ruin upon those who had dared to take my child. 13 men killed you, my baby, I whispered, my voice barely audible, yet laden with the weight of absolute certainty, with the unshakable force of a promise made to the dead. 13 men will die for what they have done. 1 for each day you suffered with hunger, 1 for each year of your life cruelly cut short, 1 for each breath they stole from your innocent lungs. This I swear, by the spirits of our ancestors, by the power that flows within my blood, by the love that will never die, even though your precious body has been broken. The Spanish moss stirred in the gentle breeze, as if the very trees themselves were leaning in, listening intently to my pronouncements, bearing witness to my sacred oath. And somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird, a solitary harbinger of doom, began to sing a haunting melody that sounded eerily like a mournful funeral dirge, a lament for the life that had been so unjustly taken. The spirits were already gathering, drawn by the promise of impending justice and the scent of blood that would soon flow as payment for the innocent life that had been so carelessly and cruelly extinguished. Master Bogard and his 12 overseers remained blissfully unaware that they had just signed their own death warrants, sealed their own grim and agonizing fates. They foolishly believed they had demonstrated their power by killing a child for stealing an apple. But in reality, they had irrevocably sealed their own doom by murdering the son of a woman who could summon forces far beyond their limited comprehension or control, forces that would descend upon them with the unstoppable fury of a hurricane. The plantation house stood in the distance, a stark white monument to human cruelty, its imposing columns and sprawling porches designed to project an image of genteel southern civilization, a facade of wealth and power built upon a foundation of suffering and stolen lives. But I could see right through the deceptive exterior, could see the festering rot that lay hidden beneath the veneer of prosperity, the putrid stench of greed and corruption that permeated every corner of that cursed place. I could smell the pervasive spiritual decay that emanated from men who had built their obscene wealth on the systematic brutalization of other human beings, men who would soon pay the ultimate price for their inhumanity. That night, as the plantation settled into an uneasy silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howls of restless dogs, as the other slaves whispered fervent prayers for Baptiste's departed soul, I began the meticulous work that would transform their casual cruelty into a living nightmare, a horror beyond their most terrifying imaginings. In the cramped cabin that I shared with Celeste and 2 other slave women, a space barely large enough to turn around in, I cleared a small space on the earthen floor and began to gather the necessary materials, the ingredients I would need to craft the instruments of their impending destruction. 13 dolls, 1 for each of the men who had participated in the killing of my son. Each doll would be painstakingly crafted with meticulous attention to detail, incorporating personal items from its intended victim. Hair, clothing fibers, nail clippings, anything that would establish a profound spiritual connection between the doll and the man it represented, binding them together in a bond of inescapable fate. Each doll would be blessed with the ancient rituals that my grandmother had taught me, imbued with the power of the spirits who demanded justice for the innocent blood that had been so carelessly spilled, the spirits who thirsted for vengeance. The first doll I created was for Master Bogard himself, the man who had pronounced the death sentence with such chilling indifference, the architect of my son's demise. I used clay sourced from the banks of the mighty Mississippi River, the lifeblood of the South, now stained with the blood and tears of generations of enslaved people. I mixed the clay with graveyard dirt, gathered under the cloak of darkness from the final resting place of forgotten souls, and a drop of blood drawn from my own finger, a sacrifice to seal the unholy pact, to forge an unbreakable connection. Strands of Spanish moss, gathered from the very tree on which my son had been hanged, served as the doll's hair, a constant reminder of the injustice that fueled my rage. A scrap of fabric torn from one of his discarded shirts provided the clothing, binding the doll to its intended victim with an invisible thread of fate. As I worked, I chanted the ancient words that my grandmother had passed down to me, whispers carried on the wind from the distant shores of Africa, calling upon the spirits of our ancestors to witness my work and bless my righteous purpose. The lows who governed justice and revenge stirred in response to my fervent call, and I could feel their powerful presence filling the small cabin, a tangible force that vibrated in the very air, like the swirling smoke from a sacred fire. Papa Legba, opener of the way, I call upon you to clear the path for justice, I whispered, my skilled hands shaping the clay with practiced ease, molding the doll with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Baron Samedi, Lord of the Dead, I beseech you to prepare a place for those who have murdered the innocent. Ursuli Danter, fierce mother, I beg you to lend me your strength in this sacred work of righteous vengeance. The doll took shape under my nimble fingers, gradually becoming more than just clay, moss, and fabric. It transformed into a vessel for the potent spiritual forces that would soon claim Master Bogard's life, a conduit for the wrath of the ancestors. When it was finally complete, I held it up to the soft moonlight that filtered through the cabin's single, grimy window, and I could have sworn I saw it move ever so slightly, as if already animated by the formidable power I had invested within it, as if it were already drawing breath in anticipation of the coming storm. Claude Bogard, I said, speaking directly to the doll as if it were the man himself, my voice a low, menacing growl. You kill my son for an apple. Now you will pay for that apple with your own life. The spirits have heard my anguished call, and they are coming for you. I carefully wrapped the doll in a piece of black cloth, shrouding it in darkness, and placed it reverently in a sturdy wooden box where I kept my most sacred items, the bones, herbs, and stones that connected me to the vibrant spiritual realm that existed in parallel to the oppressive world of slavery, the tools of my craft. Tomorrow, I would begin the laborious work on the second doll, and the day after that, the third, until all 13 instruments of justice had been meticulously completed and blessed, until the scales of justice had been balanced with the blood of the guilty. But even as I methodically planned the creation of the remaining dolls, I could already feel the intense power building relentlessly around the first one, the force of my rage focused and channeled into a weapon of divine retribution. I could sense the potent spiritual forces gathering like ominous storm clouds on the distant horizon, the rumbling of thunder portending the coming devastation. Master Bogard had less than 2 weeks to live, though he remained blissfully unaware that his agonizing death was already approaching with the inexorable certainty of the tide, that his fate was already sealed in the spirit world. The other 12 men who had participated in my son's murder would follow him into the waiting grave, one by one, day by day, until the debt of blood had been paid in full, until the scales of justice had been balanced. The plantation that had callously taken my precious child's life would become a charnel house, a chilling monument to the terrible price that must inevitably be paid when innocent blood is spilled for the sake of maintaining an evil and unjust system. I thought of Baptiste as I worked tirelessly through the night, vividly remembering his infectious laugh and his gentle nature, his unwavering love for his little sister, and his hopeful dreams of someday tasting freedom, of walking on land that he could call his own. He had been a truly good boy, kind and generous, and full of boundless hope despite the cruel circumstances of his birth. He had deserved to live, to grow into a man, to have children of his own, and to tell them loving stories about their grandmother who had cherished them even before they were born. Instead, He was now dead, his lifeless body hanging from a coarse rope because 13 men had coldly decided that his life was worth less than a single stolen apple. But his senseless death would not be in vain. It would serve as the catalyst for a cataclysmic reckoning that would shake the very foundations of the plantation system itself, and it would demonstrate to anyone who bothered to pay close attention that there were forces in the world far more powerful than whips and chains, and the casual cruelty of men who foolishly fancied themselves as gods. The Spanish moss outside my small window stirred rhythmically in the night breeze, whispering secrets of the past and promises of the future. And somewhere in the inky darkness, I could hear the distinct sound of drums, the ancient rhythm that echoed in my very soul. Not physical drums beaten by human hands, but the deep, resonant spiritual rhythm that connected all the scattered children of Africa to their ancestral homeland and the ancient powers that dwelled there. The spirits were awakening, drawn irresistibly by the potent promise of justice and the unmistakable scent of blood that would soon flow in payment for the heinous crime that had been committed. 13 men had murdered my son. 13 men would die. The grim count would begin on the morrow, and it would not end until the last of them had paid the ultimate price for their willing participation in the murder of an innocent child. The voodoo dolls that would serve as the instruments of their destruction were already taking shape in my mind's eye, each one meticulously crafted with the specific purpose of claiming a particular life in a particular, agonizing way. The spirits would guide my trembling hands as I worked tirelessly through the night, and they would bless each doll with the necessary power to reach across the ethereal veil between the physical and spiritual worlds and claim its intended victim. Master Bogard and his 12 overseers naively thought they had demonstrated their unbridled power by killing a child. But in reality, they had unwittingly awakened something far more dangerous and terrible than they could ever possibly imagine, a force that would consume them all. The grief-stricken mother, whose beloved son they had so casually murdered, was about to become their implacable nemesis, and the ancient powers she served were already sharpening their deadly claws in anticipation of the coming feast of righteous vengeance that was about to begin. The second night after Baptiste's horrifying execution, I began the arduous work on the remaining 12 dolls that would serve as the instruments of divine justice, the vessels of my wrath. Each one required careful planning and precise execution, as the spiritual connection between the doll and its intended victim had to be absolutely perfect for the curse to take firm hold, for the vengeance to be exacted in full. I had learned these potent arts from my grandmother, who had learned them from her own grandmother before her, in an unbroken chain of sacred knowledge that stretched all the way back to the African motherland across the vast ocean, a lineage of power that had been passed down through generations of women, each a guardian of our heritage, each a warrior against the forces of oppression. The second doll was for Samuel Briggs, the loathsome head overseer who had been the very first to agree with Master Bogard's cruel death sentence, the eager executioner of my son's fate. Briggs was a particularly cruel man who derived sadistic pleasure from the suffering of others, who had personally administered countless brutal beatings, and who had been known to heartlessly separate loving families for his own perverse amusement, tearing apart the bonds that held our community together. He kept a meticulously maintained collection of whips in his cramped cabin, each one specifically designed for a certain type of punishment, and he maintained them with the same care that other men might lavish on fine musical instruments, polishing the leather and sharpening the tips with a perverse sense of pride. I had managed to obtain a few precious strands of his coarse, greasy hair from the local barber shop in town, where he went like clockwork every month to have his unkempt beard trimmed, a ritual of vanity in a man devoid of any redeeming qualities. The barber, a free man of color named Jean-Baptiste, a distant cousin of my late husband, was deeply sympathetic to the plight of enslaved people, and he had quietly collected the hair clippings for me when I explained the urgent purpose for which I needed them, understanding the gravity of my mission. He fully understood the power of voodoo, and he respected the justice it could provide when the white man's law offered absolutely no recourse, when the courts of men turned a blind eye to our suffering. The clay for Briggs's doll came from the very same riverbank as the first, imbued with the spirit of the land, but I mixed it carefully with different potent elements to specifically reflect his particularly vile nature and the uniquely agonizing death that awaited him. Red clay, symbolizing the gratuitous violence he had so gleefully inflicted on others, the blood he had spilled without remorse. Graveyard dirt carefully gathered from the tomb of a man who had died by choking, a symbol of the suffocation that awaited him, the inability to draw breath as his life ebbed away. And a few precious drops of my own life's blood to irrevocably seal the unbreakable spiritual connection, binding him to his fate with a force that could not be denied. As I painstakingly shaped the doll, molding it with the intensity of my hatred, I could feel the ominous presence of Baron Samedi growing palpably stronger, his skeletal hand reaching out from the shadows. His echoing laughter reverberated throughout the spiritual realm as he eagerly prepared to claim yet another victim, another soul for his collection. The omnipotent Lord of the Dead took particular pleasure in collecting the tormented souls of those who had caused undue suffering to others, and he was extremely eager to add the cruel Samuel Briggs to his ever-growing collection, to add him to the ranks of the damned. Samuel Briggs, I whispered menacingly to the crude doll as I worked through the dark night, my voice laced with venom. You have callously whipped the flesh from the backs of innocent people, have ruthlessly separated children from their loving mothers, and have brazenly taken pleasure in the abject pain of those who could not effectively fight back. Now you will learn, in the most excruciating way imaginable, what it truly means to suffer, to desperately struggle for breath, and to feel your life inexorably slipping away while others impassively watch and do absolutely nothing to help you. The third doll was for Marcus Cole, the youngest of the overseers, a man barely 25 years old, who had already cultivated a well-deserved reputation for imaginative and cruel acts, a prodigy of pain. He specialized in a particularly vile form of psychological torture, using thinly veiled threats and public humiliation to break his victims' spirits before even resorting to physical violence, chipping away at their humanity until they were nothing more than hollow shells. He harbored a particular hatred for innocent children, viewing them as future threats to the plantation's tenuous security, and he had been especially vocal in his enthusiastic support for Baptiste's summary execution, seeing in his death a way to solidify his own position. For Cole's doll, I used Spanish moss that had been carefully soaked in fetid swamp water, symbolizing the slow and agonizing drowning death that inexorably awaited him, the murky depths that would soon claim his life. The clay was mixed meticulously with thick mud carefully dredged from the bottom of the bayou, where the restless spirits of those who had died by drowning were said to perpetually dwell, their spectral forms forever trapped in the watery abyss. A single button carefully cut from his coat, obtained by bribing one of the house slaves who did his laundry, provided the essential personal connection that would allow the powerful curse to unerringly find its intended target, to lock onto his essence. Marcus Cole, I said, holding the completed doll aloft in the pale moonlight, feeling the chill of the bayou seeping into my bones. You have callously delighted in the inconsolable tears of helpless children, and have found immense pleasure in breaking the spirits of those who should have been protected from all harm. Now, the treacherous waters will claim you, will relentlessly fill your lungs as you have filled the fragile hearts of so many others with abject despair. The fourth doll was for William Frost, an overseer notoriously known for his frequent use of fire as a favored tool of cruel punishment, a pyromaniac in the service of injustice. He had burned the delicate hands of slaves who had been caught stealing and had callously used red-hot branding irons to disfigure the faces of those who had attempted to escape the brutal confines of the plantation, marking them forever as property. He had once forced a group of terrified field hands to watch in horror as he burned down their small chapel simply because they had been holding unauthorized religious services, snuffing out their faith with a flick of the wrist. Frost's doll was meticulously crafted with clay that had been fired in a crude kiln, hardening it and making it resistant to the touch, then thoroughly mixed with ashes carefully swept up from the smoldering remains of the burned chapel, the remnants of shattered faith. A few charred threads from a tattered shirt that had been scorched during one of his particularly sadistic punishment sessions completed the morbid creation. The dark spiritual irony was almost too perfect. The man who had so frequently used fire as a weapon would himself be consumed by the very flames he had so often wielded, a fitting end for a man who had reveled in destruction. William Frost, I intoned, feeling the tangible heat of the spiritual fire beginning to build around the disturbing doll, the crackling energy that presaged his fiery demise. You have heartlessly burned the flesh of the innocent, and have needlessly destroyed the sacred places where desperate people sought fleeting comfort in their unending suffering. Now you will burn as you have made others burn, and you will soon feel the agonizing flames consuming your own flesh, even as you have consumed the flickering hope of those who were so cruelly under your power. Each successive doll required more careful planning and more specific spiritual preparations, each a complex tapestry of materials and intentions, each a thread in the web of my vengeance. The fifth doll was for James Porter, a particularly nasty man who took great pride in his well-honed ability to break wild horses, and who had callously applied the very same brutal techniques to breaking the spirits of human beings, crushing their wills with the same ruthless efficiency. The sixth was for Thomas Nash, who had developed a sophisticated system of punishment based on systematic starvation, and who had morbidly delighted in watching his helpless victims grow weak and increasingly desperate, their bodies wasting away before his very eyes. The seventh doll represented Henry Walsh, an overseer who specialized in the skillful use of dogs to relentlessly track runaway slaves, and who had meticulously trained his ravenous pack to be particularly vicious in their attacks on captured fugitives, unleashing his hounds with a cruel glee. The eighth was for Robert Kane, a man who had made an exact science of the whip, and who could expertly deliver precisely the right number of lashes needed to cause the maximum amount of searing pain without actually killing his unfortunate victim, a master of torment. The ninth doll was painstakingly crafted for Michael O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had enthusiastically embraced the cruel plantation system with the fervor of a zealous convert, fanatically determined to prove his worthiness to be fully accepted by the established white community, shedding his own heritage to embrace the system of oppression. The 10th represented David Murphy, another recent Irish immigrant who had eagerly found in the overseer's coveted position a means to exercise the kind of raw power that had been unjustly denied to him in his beloved homeland, a chance to lord over others. The 11th doll was for Patrick Sullivan, a man whose shocking cruelty was matched only by his breathtaking stupidity, who had risen to his influential position solely through his unquestioning willingness to blindly follow orders without even a flicker of conscience, a mindless puppet dancing to the tune of oppression. The 12th was for Shao Ali, the youngest of all the overseers, who had been openly eager to prove himself worthy of his coveted position by actually exceeding even his seasoned colleagues in the unchecked brutality of his punishments, a hunger for power that knew no bounds. Each doll was meticulously crafted with specific materials that directly reflected the unique nature of its intended victim and the specific type of agonizing death that awaited him, a custom-made curse designed to inflict the maximum amount of suffering. Each doll was then carefully blessed with the appropriate ancient rituals and charged with the potent spiritual power necessary to reach across the gossamer veil between the physical and spiritual worlds, to pierce the veil of reality and deliver my vengeance. Each was finally wrapped in simple black cloth and reverently placed in my sacred box, where the combined power of all 13 dolls would relentlessly build and focus until it became an unstoppable force of divine justice, a hurricane of retribution. As I worked through the long night on the final dolls, I could feel the palpable spiritual pressure building relentlessly in the small cabin, the energy crackling in the air. I could sense the growing presence of the powerful Lows growing steadily stronger with each carefully completed figure, their eyes fixed on the task at hand. The very air itself seemed to thicken with concentrated power, and the other women who shared the cramped cabin began to complain of increasingly strange dreams and other unexplained and disturbing sensations, sensing the shift in the balance of power. "Marie," whispered Celeste, my surviving daughter, her eyes wide with fear as she warily watched me work diligently on the 13th and final doll. "What in God's name are you doing? I can feel something strange in the air, something that makes my skin crawl and my heart race in my chest." "I am preparing justice for your brother," I replied, not looking up from my painstaking work, my focus absolute. 13 men killed Baptiste, and 13 men will pay the ultimate price for his life. The spirits have heard my anguished call, and they are gathering to collect what is rightfully owed. The 13th and final doll was undoubtedly the most important of them all, the keystone of my revenge, as it represented Master Bogart himself, the heartless man who had pronounced the cruel death sentence, who had ruthlessly condemned my precious son to die for the simple crime of trying to feed his desperately sick sister. This particularly potent doll required the most powerful spiritual preparations, the most carefully selected materials, and the most profoundly potent blessings. It required every ounce of my strength and will. The clay came directly from the graveyard where the plantation's former masters were buried, the soil saturated with the arrogance of their power, carefully mixed with dark dirt from the crossroads where the spirits were said to congregate at the stroke of midnight, a nexus of energy where the veil between worlds was thin. Wisps of Spanish moss scavenged. Hair harvested from the boughs of the accursed hanging tree served as the doll's coarse, unsettling hair, each strand imbued with the agony of past injustices. A small piece of fabric, torn with reverence from Master Bogart's own pillowcase, provided the essential, intimate connection, anchoring the spell to its target. The doll was then lovingly, painstakingly anointed with rare oils, each drop carefully blessed by the vengeful spirits of justice and retribution, spirits hungry for recompense. Finally, it was wrapped in a square of rough-spun cloth, visibly stained with the bitter tears I had wept for my son, each drop a testament to my inconsolable grief. Claude Bogart, I declared, holding the completed doll gingerly in both hands, feeling the full, terrifying power of the turbulent spiritual realm focusing intently on this single, potent figure. The air around me crackled with barely contained energy. You are the principal architect of my son's premature death, the cold-hearted man who so casually decided that his precious life was worth less than a stolen apple. You will be the very last to die. You will watch, helpless and paralyzed by dread, as your trusted overseers fall one by one, and you will finally understand that the corrupt power you thought you wielded was nothing, a mere flicker, compared to the ancient forces you have unwittingly awakened. With all 13 dolls finally completed, each meticulously blessed and imbued with purpose, I carefully arranged them in a perfect circle on the earthen floor of the cramped cabin. Each crude figure faced inward, positioned precisely toward a single candle that burned with an eerie, unsettling flame, a flame that seemed to dance to its own sinister rhythm, defying the still air. The palpable spiritual energy in the small room was now so incredibly intense that it was almost physically visible, distorting the air itself. Strange shadows danced independently of the flickering candlelight, elongated and grotesque, and disembodied sounds, whispers from beyond the veil, seemed to emanate from another world entirely, chilling me to the bone. I began the complex final ritual, the incantation that would permanently activate the potent curse, calling upon all the ancient spirits who govern justice and righteous retribution to witness my sacred work and bless my vengeful purpose. The haunting words I spoke were in the old, forgotten language that my grandmother had painstakingly taught me, the sacred tongue that irrevocably connected all the scattered children of Africa to their ancestral homeland and the powerful laws that dwelled there, the watchful deities who remembered every injustice. Spirits of the ancestors, hear my desperate call. I chanted, feeling the raw power building relentlessly around me like an approaching storm about to break, thunder rumbling in the distance. A child has been unjustly murdered, and innocent blood has been spilled without remorse, staining the very ground we walk upon. Justice has been callously denied by those who deceitfully claim to serve it, twisting the law to their own wicked ends. I fervently call upon you to right this terrible wrong, to justly claim the forfeit lives of those who so brutally took the life of my precious son, and to finally demonstrate to the unrepentant world that there are indeed powers in this world far greater than the whips and chains of mortal men. The solitary candle flame suddenly flared dramatically higher, casting wild, dancing shadows on the cabin walls as the anxiously waiting spirits eagerly responded to my desperate call, drawn by the promise of vengeance. I could feel their intense presence filling the cramped cabin, a palpable weight in the air, and I could sense their collective eagerness to finally begin the work of divine justice that had been so tragically delayed. The 13 crude dolls seemed to pulse with their own inner light, each one now irrevocably connected to its intended victim by nearly invisible threads of potent spiritual power, lifelines soon to be severed. Let the grim count begin, I whispered menacingly, feeling the awesome curse take firm hold with the resounding finality of a judge's gavel, the sound echoing in the spiritual realm. 13 days, 13 deaths, 13 just payments for the innocent life of one blameless child. Let no one ever say again that the blood of the innocent can be spilled without exacting a terrible consequence, that the powerless have absolutely no recourse against the powerful, or that the spirits of our ancestors have somehow forgotten how to deliver swift and unyielding justice to those who so richly deserve it. The arduous ritual was finally complete, the awesome curse was fully activated, and the inexorable countdown to divine justice had officially begun. On the morrow, the first of the 13 guilty men would certainly die, and each grim day thereafter would bring another agonizing death until the full debt had been finally and irrevocably paid. Master Bogard and his heartless overseers remained blissfully unaware of what was relentlessly coming for them, the storm gathering on the horizon. They had absolutely no understanding of the vengeful forces they had unwittingly awakened when they coldly decided to murder a child for stealing an apple, an act they deemed a trifle. But they would soon learn, one agonizing death at a time, that there were powers in this world far more ancient and terrifying than their casual cruelty. The blood of the innocent cried out for vengeance from the spiritual realm, and a mother's love could reach beyond the grave, demanding justice for her murdered child. The voodoo dolls sat in their circle like silent, watchful sentinels, each imbued with the power to claim a specific life in a uniquely terrible way, tailored to their sins. The spirits were gathering, drawn by the intoxicating promise of blood and the long-delayed scent of justice, their shadows lengthening across the land. The plantation, once a bastion of secure power, a symbol of unyielding dominance, was about to become a conduit for these forces, a channel house of vengeful energy, a battleground between worlds. The men who had considered themselves untouchable, immune to consequence, were about to learn the true, bone-chilling meaning of fear, a fear that would consume them from the inside out. Dawn broke gray and oppressively humid over the Bogard plantation, a thick, suffocating humidity that presaged the coming storm, on the morning that would mark the beginning of the end for the 13 men who had murdered an innocent child. As I went about my daily tasks in the big house, serving breakfast, cleaning rooms, feigning the submissive slave they expected me to be, I could feel the spiritual forces I had awakened stirring like a gathering storm, a palpable tension in the air, poised to claim their first victim. The 13 voodoo dolls remained hidden in my cabin, wrapped in black cloth, each charged with the power to reach across the veil between worlds and extinguish the lives of those who had condemned my son. But their influence was already seeping throughout the plantation like an invisible plague, touching the minds and bodies of the marked men with the first chilling whispers of their impending doom, the prelude to their agonizing end. Samuel Briggs, the head overseer and the first to die, seemed unusually agitated as he made his morning rounds. I watched him from the kitchen window as he inspected the slave quarters, noticing how he constantly touched his throat, clearing it as if something were lodged there, a phantom blockage he couldn't dislodge. The spiritual noose was already tightening around his neck, though he remained blissfully unaware of the forces conspiring against him, the unseen hand reaching for him. "Something wrong with your throat, Mr. Briggs?" asked one of the field hands, a man named Joshua, who knew the sting of Briggs's whip all too well, his back a roadmap of scars. "Mind your own business, boy," Briggs snapped, his usual booming voice now raspy and strained. But his voice already sounded strained, as if speaking required a monumental effort, each word a struggle. "Get back to work before I give you something real to worry about." Yet even as he delivered his threats, Briggs continued to cough and clear his throat, his hand moving almost unconsciously to his neck as if trying to loosen an invisible collar that was choking him, a pressure he couldn't comprehend. The spirits were already at work, subtly preparing his body for the gruesome death that would arrive with the setting sun, a death tailor-made for his sins. I went about my duties with the calm satisfaction of someone who knew that justice was finally being served, the scales slowly beginning to balance. As I dusted Master Bogard's study, I could see him through the window, standing on the front porch and surveying his domain with the smug contentment of a man who believed himself invulnerable, a king surveying his kingdom. He had no idea that his own demise was a mere 12 days away, that the spiritual forces gathering around his plantation would soon claim his life along with those of his underlings, his reign of terror about to end. The other overseers went about their daily routines, oblivious to the fact that they were living their final days on earth. Marcus Cole supervised the field hands with his usual cruelty, relishing their suffering. William Frost inspected the equipment with his characteristic attention to detail, always seeking ways to maximize profit. The others carried out their duties as if nothing had changed, but I could see the subtle signs of spiritual interference beginning to manifest, small accidents, unsettling moments of confusion, and a general sense of unease that seemed to settle over the entire plantation like a heavy, suffocating fog, a premonition of what was to come. As the day progressed, Briggs's condition deteriorated noticeably. His voice became increasingly hoarse, and he began to experience difficulty swallowing, even liquids, his throat constricting with unseen force. By afternoon, he was coughing almost incessantly, a harsh, barking sound that echoed across the plantation and drew worried glances from the other overseers, a sound of impending doom. "Maybe you should see the doctor," suggested Marcus Cole during their afternoon meeting, a rare moment of concern. "That cough doesn't sound natural." "It's just the humid air," Briggs replied weakly, his voice barely a whisper now, and speaking appeared to cause him considerable pain. "I'll be fine by tomorrow," he seemed to insist, projecting an image of strength, but he would be anything but fine. Tomorrow would never come for him. As evening approached and the sun began to sink below the horizon of the Louisiana bayou, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, I could feel the spiritual forces I had awakened focusing their undivided attention on their first target, the net tightening around him. The voodoo doll representing Samuel Briggs was calling to its counterpart in the physical world, drawing his life force across the shadowy veil between worlds, preparing to claim what was owed, the price for his cruelty. I was serving dinner in the big house when the final, agonizing act began. Through the dining room window, I saw Briggs stumbling across the yard toward his cabin, one hand clutched desperately at his throat as he struggled in vain to breathe, his eyes wide with terror. The other overseers, finally noticing his distress, were following him, their faces showing the first dawning expressions of genuine concern, their complacency shattered. "Samuel," William Frost called out, his voice laced with panic. "What's wrong? You look like you're choking." And indeed, that was exactly what was happening. The spiritual noose that had been tightening relentlessly around Briggs's throat all day was now claiming its victim, cutting off his air supply with the inexorable certainty of a physical rope, a spectral garrote. He fell to his knees in the dirt, his hands clawing frantically at his neck as he fought desperately for the breath that would never come, his lungs burning with the desperate need for air. The other overseers gathered around him, attempting to help, but utterly clueless as to the true cause of his torment, blind to the spiritual forces at play. There was nothing physically wrong with his throat, no obstruction that could be removed, no injury that could be treated. The force that was killing him existed solely in the spiritual realm, far beyond the reach of mortal medicine or intervention. "Get the doctor," Master Bogard shouted from the porch, his face etched with worry, but even as the words left his mouth, Samuel Briggs convulsed violently once, and then lay still. His eyes stared sightlessly at the darkening sky, and his face was frozen in a grotesque expression of terror and disbelief, a mask of eternal horror. The first of the 13 men who had murdered my son was dead, claimed by forces utterly beyond his understanding or control, a pawn in a game he never knew he was playing. The plantation erupted in confusion and alarm as word of Briggs's sudden and inexplicable death spread like wildfire among the overseers and house slaves. Master Bogard paced the porch like a caged and agitated animal, demanding explanations that no one could provide, desperate to regain control. The doctor, when he finally arrived, could find no discernible cause of death. Briggs's body showed no signs of disease or injury, no indication whatsoever of what had killed him, leaving him utterly baffled. "It's like he just stopped breathing," the doctor told Master Bogard, his voice laced with utter bewilderment. "I've never seen anything like it. A healthy man doesn't just die for no reason." But I knew the reason, and as I quietly went about my duties in the big house, I felt a profound and deeply satisfying sense of justice at seeing the first payment extracted for my son's stolen life, the scales of justice tipping ever so slightly. The spiritual forces I had awakened were proving their power, demonstrating that there were indeed consequences for the cold-blooded murder of innocent children, and that justice could be achieved even when the so-called law offered no recourse, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The second death came precisely 24 hours later, exactly as I had foreseen. Marcus Cole, the young overseer who had specialized in psychological torture, delighting in breaking spirits, was found floating face down in the bayou that bordered the plantation. His body showed no signs of violence, no indication that he had been attacked or murdered. He had simply drowned, despite being an excellent swimmer who had grown up on the water, a paradox that defied explanation. "He must have fallen from his horse," suggested one of the other overseers, desperately searching for a logical explanation, clinging to reason. But the horse was found grazing peacefully nearby, showing no signs of having thrown its rider, its eyes calm and untroubled. Perhaps he had suffered some kind of sudden fit, lost consciousness, and fallen into the water. But there was no medical explanation for Cole's sudden demise, just as there had been none for Briggs's, a pattern emerging from the chaos. The voodoo doll that represented him had called to the spirits of the water, drawing him inexorably to the murky depths of the bayou, where the ancient entities that governed drowning had claimed his life, as just payment for the unspeakable suffering he had inflicted on others, a watery grave for a cruel heart. The plantation was now teetering on the brink of barely controlled panic, the veneer of civilization cracking under the strain. 2 overseers dead in 2 days, both from inexplicable causes, both in ways that utterly defied any rational explanation, the foundation of their world crumbling beneath their feet. Master Bogard convened an emergency meeting of his remaining subordinates, demanding answers and explanations that none of them could possibly provide, his authority waning. "This is just coincidence," he declared, but his voice lacked any real conviction, the words hollow and unconvincing. "2 unfortunate accidents, nothing more. We cannot allow superstition and fear to interfere with the proper running of this plantation." But superstition and fear were precisely what was needed to begin to understand what was truly happening, to pierce the veil of ignorance. The logical, rational world of white supremacy and efficient plantation management had no conceptual framework for comprehending the powerful spiritual forces that were systematically claiming the lives of those who had murdered an innocent child, their worldview shattered. The third death arrived precisely on schedule, exactly as I had foreseen. William Frost, the overseer who had specialized in using fire as a tool of cruel punishment, inflicting burns and agony, was found burned to death inside his cabin. The fire had consumed only his body, leaving the rest of the room utterly untouched, an impossible phenomenon. An absolute impossibility that completely defied all known natural laws, but made perfect sense in the spiritual realm, where true justice was being dispensed with ruthless efficiency, an eye for an eye. "The lamp must have exploded," suggested one of the remaining overseers, grasping at straws, desperately seeking a logical explanation. But there was absolutely no evidence of any lamp explosion, no sign of any accelerant that could have caused such a localized and intensely destructive fire, the cabin untouched by flame. Frost had simply burned, consumed by the very element he had so often used to torture others, claimed by the vengeful spirits of fire who had answered my desperate call for justice, a fitting end for a man consumed by cruelty. By the fourth day, the horrifying pattern was becoming chillingly clear, even to those who stubbornly refused to believe in the existence of the supernatural, their denial crumbling in the face of overwhelming evidence. One overseer was dying each day, each death occurring in a macabre manner that eerily mirrored the specific cruelties that the man had inflicted on others, a karmic retribution. The plantation was descending into utter chaos, the wheels of industry grinding to a halt. The remaining overseers were now gripped by stark terror, afraid to sleep alone, and the enslaved population was beginning to exhibit subtle signs of a dawning hope and defiance that had been conspicuously absent for years, a flicker of rebellion in their eyes. "It's that Marie," I overheard one of the house slaves whisper furtively to another, her voice barely audible. "She's got the power, just like her grandmother did. She's calling down death on the men who killed her boy." "Hush," the other replied nervously, glancing around, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't let them hear you talking like that. They'll think we're all involved in whatever's happening." But the white men on the plantation were far too frightened and confused to think clearly about anything, their minds reeling. They were confronting forces far beyond their limited comprehension, facing a power that their strictly rational minds simply could not accept or understand, trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The absolute confidence that had once characterized their iron-fisted rule was now crumbling rapidly in the face of deaths that defied any logical explanation and a terrifying pattern that strongly suggested supernatural intervention, their reign of terror unraveling. The fourth death was James Porter, the man who had taken a perverse pride in his ruthless ability to break both horses and human beings, his methods brutal and unforgiving. He was found trampled to death in the stable, his body horribly crushed by hooves that had somehow left no telltale tracks in the soft dirt around him, a mystery that deepened the terror. The horses in the stable were calm and undisturbed, showing absolutely no signs of having been involved in any kind of violent incident, their eyes gentle and innocent. The fifth death was Thomas Nash, who had devised an elaborate system of punishment based on starvation, relishing the power he held over life and death. He was found dead in his cabin, his emaciated body showing all the unmistakable signs of having starved to death, despite having consumed a full meal only hours before, a cruel irony. His stomach was completely empty, his body was shockingly emaciated, and his contorted face was frozen in a mask of desperate and insatiable hunger, and its eternal torment. By the sixth day, Master Bogard was clearly beginning to crack under the immense pressure, his grip on reality loosening. He had lost half of his overseers in less than a week, and the plantation was rapidly becoming impossible to manage, the workforce paralyzed by fear. The remaining white men were now too terrified to venture out alone, and the enslaved population was beginning to exhibit open signs of hope and even defiance that had been absent for years, their spirits slowly being rekindled. "We need to bring in help," he told his wife during a tense dinner, his voice shaking with barely controlled fear, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Call in the militia. Bring in investigators from New Orleans. Do something, anything to stop whatever is happening here." But what was happening could not be stopped by mere militia or rational investigators, their weapons useless against the unseen foe. The spiritual forces I had awakened were far beyond the reach of any mortal intervention, guided solely by a relentless justice that transcended human law and fueled by a mother's boundless love that would not be denied, an unstoppable force. The sixth death was Henry Walsh, the overseer who had specialized in using dogs to track down runaway slaves, hunting them down like animals. He was found mauled to death behind the kennels, his body torn to shreds by teeth and claws that had somehow left no other traces, an act of retribution. The dogs were found sleeping peacefully in their pens, showing no signs whatsoever of having been involved in any kind of attack, their faces serene. The seventh death was Robert Kane, the man who had made a twisted science out of the application of the whip, perfecting the art of inflicting pain. He was found beaten to death in his cabin, his body bearing the precise and unmistakable pattern of injuries that he had inflicted on countless slaves over the years, a mirroring of his cruelty. But there were no weapons at the scene, no signs of any struggle, and no indication of how the brutal beating had been administered, a supernatural assault. As the first week of deaths drew to a close and the second week began, the plantation had been completely transformed from a proud symbol of white supremacy into a veritable house of horrors, a place of terror and dread, where death stalked the corridors and claimed a new victim each agonizing day, the air thick with fear. The remaining overseers were barely functional, jumping at shadows and starting at every unexpected sound, their nerves frayed. But the horrific count was not yet complete. 6 men had already died, but 7 more remained to pay the ultimate price for my son's murder, the balance of justice incomplete. The voodoo dolls continued their relentless work, calling out across the veil between worlds and claiming the miserable lives of those who had condemned an innocent child to death for the simple crime of trying to feed his desperately sick sister, a crime of compassion. Justice was being served, one agonizing death at a time, and the vengeful spirits would not rest until the full and terrible debt had been paid in full. A reckoning was at hand. The 8th day dawned with a tangible pall of terror hanging over the Bogard plantation like a suffocating physical presence, a weight pressing down on everything. Michael O'Brien, the Irish overseer who had embraced the plantation system with the fanatical fervor of a recent convert, eager to prove his loyalty, was found dead inside the cotton gin. His body had been gruesomely crushed by machinery that had somehow activated itself during the dead of night, despite being securely shut down and properly secured, a mechanical nightmare. The gears and wheels showed no signs of any malfunction, no indication whatsoever of how they had suddenly started moving, or why they had stopped immediately after claiming their intended victim, a ghostly intervention. Master Bogard stood beside the mutilated body, his face pale and drawn, his hands trembling visibly as he struggled desperately to maintain some semblance of authority in the face of powerful forces he could neither understand nor control, his world unraveling. The plantation, which had once been his pride and joy, his supreme symbol of power and unbridled prosperity, had now become a living nightmare, where death stalked the corridors and claimed a new victim each day with uncanny and supernatural precision, a curse upon the land. "This has to stop," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible above the hushed whispers of the enslaved people who had gathered to witness the latest manifestation of divine justice, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Someone is doing this. Someone is methodically killing my overseers, and I want to know who is responsible." But even as he uttered the words, he seemed to grasp their utter futility, his quest for answers pointless. The deaths that had been plaguing his plantation for over a week now completely defied any rational explanation, occurring in ways that strongly suggested supernatural intervention rather than the actions of any human agency, a force beyond his comprehension. The logical, rational world of plantation management and white supremacy had no framework for understanding what was truly happening, and absolutely no tools for fighting an unseen enemy that existed solely in the spiritual realm, a battle he was destined to lose. I watched silently from the kitchen window as the remaining overseers gathered somberly around the broken body of their dead colleague, their faces etched with the kind of deep-seated fear that only comes from confronting forces far beyond the scope of human comprehension, their bravado gone. David Murphy, Patrick Sullivan, and Sean Ollie, 3 men who had once strutted proudly around the plantation with the unshakable confidence of absolute power, now huddled together like frightened children, jumping nervously at every shadow and starting at every unexpected sound, their world shrinking. "We should leave," Murphy suggested urgently, his thick Irish accent betraying his raw terror, his voice trembling. "Pack up our things and get out of here before whatever's killing us claims the rest of us." "And go where?" Sullivan replied, his voice cracking with emotional strain, his eyes wide with fear. "This thing, whatever it is, it's not going to suddenly stop just because we change locations. It's following a pattern, picking us off one by one. Running won't save us. There's no escape." "Then what do you suggest we do?" Ollie asked, his once youthful face now aged prematurely by a week of constant fear, the joy gone from his eyes. We can't fight something we can't even see. We can't even begin to understand what's killing us, or how to stop it. They were absolutely right. There was indeed no escape from the swift justice that was now being ruthlessly dispensed, their fate sealed. There was no way to avoid the powerful spiritual forces that had been awakened by the brutal murder of an innocent child, their sins catching up to them. The voodoo dolls that represented each of them were calling out relentlessly across the shadowy veil between worlds, inexorably drawing their rapidly fading life forces into the unseen realm where the vengeful spirits of the ancestors eagerly waited to claim what was rightfully owed, their souls destined for torment. The ninth death came that very evening as the sun began to set ominously over the bayou, casting long, distorted shadows across the land, and the Spanish moss stirred eerily in the heavy, humid breeze, a sign of the spirits moving. David Murphy was found hanged inside his cabin, suspended lifelessly from a rope that showed no signs of having been tied by human hands. An impossible feat, the intricate knots were unlike anything the other overseers had ever seen, complex, ever-shifting patterns that. The knots on the rope securing David's lifeless body seemed to subtly writhe and rearrange themselves when observed directly, as though they were only partially anchored in this reality, their true form existing just beyond our perception. He didn't hang himself, Patrick Sullivan declared, his voice thick with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination as he stared at the swaying corpse. David wasn't the type to just give up, to simply surrender to despair. He wasn't the kind of man to take his own life. Someone did this to him. But who? Sean Ollie asked, his voice barely audible, a mere whisper lost in the oppressive air of the plantation. Who could have gotten into his cabin unseen? And how could they have overpowered him, a man as strong as David, and strung him up like that? And what kind of rope makes knots like those? They were trapped in a circle of unanswered questions, because the true answers resided in a realm they stubbornly, almost defiantly, refused to acknowledge, let alone understand. The relentless spiritual forces that were systematically claiming their lives, one agonizing death at a time, operated according to immutable laws that transcended the limitations of physical reality, following intricate patterns that mirrored the profound, cosmic justice that quietly governed the entire universe, a justice hidden beneath the superficial chaos and random chance of everyday existence. Master Bogard, his arrogance shaken but not yet broken, had summoned assistance from New Orleans, desperately seeking to contain the escalating horror. He brought in teams of seasoned investigators and heavily armed militia, hoping to solve the rapidly unfolding mystery of the dying overseers. But the men who arrived, armed with their rational minds and unwavering belief in the tangible world, found nothing that they could possibly comprehend. There was absolutely no tangible evidence of human agency in these bizarre deaths, deaths that so blatantly defied the known laws of nature. They interrogated the enslaved population, searching desperately for any hint of conspiracy, any flicker of rebellion in their eyes, but they found only a quiet, understated satisfaction, the kind that blossoms from finally witnessing long-delayed justice being served. "The slaves aren't talking," reported Captain Morrison, the grim militia officer assigned to investigate the inexplicable deaths. His face was etched with frustration and a growing unease. "They all claim to know absolutely nothing about what's been happening, but there's something in their eyes, a knowing glint, like they're watching a play they've been eagerly anticipating for many long years." "Of course, they're enjoying this," Master Bogard retorted bitterly, his voice dripping with disdain. "They see my overseers dying, and they actually believe it's some kind of divine retribution, some kind of supernatural payback. But this isn't God's work. This is cold-blooded murder, plain and simple, and someone is going to pay dearly for it." But he was tragically, fatally wrong about the true nature of what was happening. His stubborn refusal to acknowledge the powerful spiritual forces at work would ultimately contribute directly to his own agonizing destruction. The horrific deaths that were claiming his overseers were, in fact, divine retribution, justice dispensed by entities far older than Christianity, entities far more terrifying than any mere mortal. The 10th death was Patrick Sullivan, found frozen solid inside his cabin despite the sweltering Louisiana heat. His entire body was encased in a thick layer of frost that immediately melted upon contact, and his contorted face was frozen in a grotesque mask of absolute, soul-shattering terror. The cabin showed no trace of any cooling mechanism, no logical explanation for how the internal temperature could have plummeted low enough to freeze a human being solid. "This is absolutely impossible," the bewildered doctor declared, examining Sullivan's frozen corpse with growing bewilderment and a touch of fear. "You simply cannot freeze to death in 90-degree weather. There's no reasonable, natural explanation for what happened to this man." But natural explanations were utterly irrelevant when dealing with supernatural forces. The ancient spirits that governed ice and cold had answered my anguished call for justice and had claimed Sullivan's miserable life as just payment for the unspeakable suffering he had inflicted on so many others. The voodoo doll that represented him had called out urgently to the dark realm of eternal winter and agonizing death, drawing the freezing cold across the thin veil between worlds to claim its hapless victim. By the 11th day, only Sean Ollie remained alive among the original overseers, a young man barely out of his teens, who had been eager to prove himself worthy of his coveted position by eagerly surpassing his older colleagues in acts of casual brutality. He was now a broken shell of his former self, unable to sleep or eat, jumping nervously at every shadow and starting wildly at every unexpected sound. The vibrant arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed terror. "I'm going to die tomorrow," he told Master Bogard with a flat, toneless voice devoid of all emotion. "Whatever's killing us, it's systematically working its way through the list, and I'm next. There's absolutely no point in running. There's no point in even hiding. It's going to find me wherever I go." "Don't talk like that," Master Bogard replied weakly, his voice lacking any real conviction, any genuine hope. "We'll find a way to stop this somehow. We'll find whoever is responsible and make them pay for what they've done." But even as he uttered the words, he seemed to truly understand their utter futility. 11 of his original 12 overseers were now dead, killed by forces that defied any rational explanation and followed a macabre pattern that clearly suggested some form of supernatural intervention. The once proud plantation, which had for so long been his ultimate symbol of power and unbridled prosperity, had become a charnel house where death claimed a new victim each day with unnerving, clockwork precision. The 11th death came precisely at midnight as Sean Ollie sat rigid with terror inside the main house under the watchful eye of an armed guard, surrounded by grim militia soldiers who had been specifically assigned to protect him at all costs. Despite their constant vigilance, despite their advanced weapons and their rigorous training, they could do absolutely nothing to prevent the powerful spiritual forces that relentlessly claimed his very life as he sat trembling in their midst. Ollie simply stopped breathing, his rapidly fading life force swiftly drawn across the shadowy veil between worlds by the waiting voodoo doll that represented him. One agonizing moment, he was undeniably alive and understandably terrified. The next instant, he was simply dead, his lifeless body showing no signs of violence or disease, no discernible indication whatsoever of what had just killed him. The soldiers who had been closely guarding him could only stare in stunned horror and abject bewilderment, completely unable to comprehend the terrifying events they had just witnessed. "How?" Captain Morrison asked hoarsely, his voice shaking with a palpable mixture of fear and raw frustration. "How did he die?" "We were watching him closely. We were standing right here, and he just suddenly stopped living. There's no wound, no poison, no sign of what could have killed him." "It's voodoo," whispered one of the terrified house slaves, a woman named Josephine, who had worked tirelessly in the big house for over 20 long years. Her face was etched with the wisdom of survival and the ancient knowledge passed down through generations. "Someone has put a terrible curse on this place. They have called down the spirits to claim the lives of those who truly deserve to die. You can't fight the vengeful spirits with mere guns and frightened soldiers. You can't protect someone who has been specifically marked for death by the ancient Loa." "Superstitious nonsense," Captain Morrison replied dismissively, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. The unwavering certainty that had defined him just days before was crumbling under the weight of the inexplicable. There has to be a rational explanation for what's been happening here. Someone is methodically killing these men, and we're going to find out exactly who is responsible. But they would never find any rational explanation because, quite simply, none existed. The horrific deaths that had now claimed 11 overseers in just 11 short days were undeniably the direct result of powerful spiritual forces that were operating according to immutable laws far beyond the limited scope of human understanding, guided solely by a sense of perfect justice that transcended any mortal comprehension. Now only Master Bogard remained, the primary architect of my beloved son's tragic death, the cruel man who had so callously pronounced the fatal sentence that had condemned young Baptiste to die for the desperate crime of stealing a single apple. He was, quite simply, the 13th and final name on the long list of those who would ultimately pay the full price for their heinous crime, the last wretched victim who would be claimed by the powerful forces I had awakened through my overwhelming grief, rage, and love. But his demise wouldn't be swift. The curse I had meticulously woven was crafted to mirror my own torment, to compel him to witness the unraveling of his domain, and to grasp that the power he once deemed absolute was insignificant compared to the forces unleashed by his heinous act of murdering an innocent child. The plantation had descended into utter pandemonium, with the enslaved population openly celebrating the demise of their oppressors, while the white community scattered in terror from inexplicable and uncontrollable forces. Master Bogard remained isolated within his grand house, haunted by the specters of his deceased overseers and the chilling awareness that his own end was approaching with the relentless certainty of the tide. "Marie," he pleaded with me on the 12th night as I served his dinner, his voice trembling with fear and desperation. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now held only a raw, animalistic terror. "I know you can hear me. I know you're responsible for what's happening here. Please, I'm begging you, stop this madness. I'll do anything you want, give you anything you ask for, just make it stop." But his pleas were futile, his bargaining came far too late. The hour for anything but justice, so long deferred, had passed. My son was dead, murdered for the simple act of trying to feed his ailing sister, and the debt of blood could only be satisfied when the last of his killers had paid the ultimate price. "Tomorrow," I stated calmly, my voice infused with unwavering conviction, a voice that held the power of centuries of suffering and resilience. "Tomorrow, you will join your overseers in death. You will make the final payment for the life you stole from my child. The spirits are waiting for you, Master Bogard. They have been patient, but their patience has reached its end." The 13th day was about to dawn, and with it would come the final act of justice that had been 13 days in the making. The 13th dawn broke, painting the Spanish moss and cypress trees in shades of crimson that seemed to foreshadow the violence that would unfold before sunset. Master Claude Bogard sat alone in his study, surrounded by the remnants of his crumbling empire. Unpaid bills, letters from creditors, and reports of enslaved people fleeing the chaos that had engulfed his once prosperous plantation. 12 of his 13 overseers were dead, claimed by forces that defied rational explanation and followed a pattern suggestive of supernatural intervention. The remaining white employees had fled in terror. Neighboring planters refused to visit, and even the local militia had withdrawn after witnessing deaths that defied their understanding of the natural world. The man who had once commanded respect and fear was now utterly alone, facing the consequences of his actions with the chilling certainty of impending doom. I went about my duties in the big house with the calm satisfaction of one who knew that justice was finally being served. As I dusted the furniture and swept the floors, I could feel the spiritual forces I had awakened gathering for their final act, preparing to claim the life of the man who had pronounced my son's death sentence with such casual indifference. The 13th voodoo doll, the one that represented Master Bogard himself, was calling across the veil between worlds with increasing intensity. I could feel its power building like a storm about to break. I could sense the spirits of the ancestors sharpening their claws for the feast of vengeance that was about to begin. "Marie," Master Bogard called to me as I entered his study to clean, his voice hollow with despair and terror. He looked up at me with eyes that had aged decades in the span of days, eyes that reflected the utter collapse of his world. "Sit with me for a moment. I want to talk to you." I paused in my work and looked at him directly, seeing for the first time the full extent of what 12 days of supernatural terror had done to him. His hair had gone completely white, a stark contrast to the dark, carefully styled locks he had once maintained. His face was gaunt and lined with premature age, etched with the marks of sleepless nights and unrelenting fear, and his hands shook with a tremor that seemed to come from his very soul. "You know what's happening here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, a plea lost in the vast emptiness of his crumbling world. "You know why my overseers are dying? Why this plantation has become a house of horrors? It's because of your son, isn't it?" "Because of what we did to Baptiste." "What you did to Baptiste," I corrected, my voice calm and steady despite the magnitude of what was about to occur. The years of suppressed grief and rage were now channeled into a chilling composure. "You killed my child for stealing an apple, condemned him to death for trying to feed his sick sister. You and 12 other men decided that his life was worth less than a piece of fruit. It was the law," he protested weakly, clinging to the justification that had long shielded him from the moral implications of his actions. "Theft is theft, regardless of the thief's age or motivation. I was enforcing the rules that govern this plantation, maintaining the order that keeps society functioning." "Your law," I replied, feeling the spiritual forces gathering around us like invisible storm clouds, their power crackling in the air. "Your order, your society, built on the blood and suffering of people you refuse to acknowledge as human beings. But there are older laws than yours, Master Bogard. There are powers in this world that care nothing for your rules and everything for justice." He stared at me with a kind of desperate hope that comes from a drowning man grasping for any available lifeline. His eyes, once filled with cold command, now pleaded with a raw, animalistic desperation. "Can you stop it? Can you call off whatever forces you've awakened? I'll free you, free all the slaves on this plantation. I'll give you money, land, whatever you want. Just make it stop." "It's too late for bargains," I said, moving closer to his desk where he sat hunched over like a broken old man, his former arrogance completely shattered. 12 men are dead, and you are the 13th. The count will be complete before this day ends, and the debt will be paid in full. Please," he whispered, tears streaming down his face, the tears of a man who had finally realized the true cost of his actions. "I have a wife, children. They don't deserve to suffer for what I've done. If you must have revenge, take it on me alone." "My son had a mother and a sister," I replied, feeling no pity for his tears or his pleas. My heart, though heavy with grief, remained resolute in its pursuit of justice. He was 14 years old, with his whole life ahead of him. You took that life without thought or hesitation, condemned him to death for the crime of love. Now you will pay the price that justice demands." As if summoned by my words, the spiritual forces that had been building throughout the morning suddenly focused their attention on the study where we sat. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, chilling the air with an unnatural cold. The shadows seemed to deepen and move independently of their sources, twisting into grotesque shapes that danced on the periphery of our vision, and the air itself began to thicken with an almost tangible presence, a weight that pressed down on us with suffocating intensity. Master Bogard felt it too, his eyes widening with terror as he sensed the approach of forces beyond his comprehension. He looked around the room with a frantic desperation, searching for some escape from the unseen threat. "What's happening?" he gasped, his breath visible in the suddenly frigid air, a ghostly cloud that hung before his face. "What's in this room with us?" "Justice," I replied simply, my voice resonating with the power of the forces I had unleashed. "The spirits of my ancestors, the Lows who govern death and retribution, the forces you awakened when you murdered an innocent child. They have come to collect what is owed." The manifestation began slowly, with shadows that moved against the light and sounds that seemed to come from another world entirely, whispers and groans that echoed in the silence of the room, building in intensity with each passing moment. Master Bogard's desk began to shake, the papers scattered across its surface rustling as if blown by an unfelt wind. The portraits of his ancestors that lined the walls seemed to watch with accusing eyes, their painted faces shifting and changing as the spiritual realm pressed against the physical world, revealing the hidden sins of generations past. "No," Master Bogard whispered, pushing back from his desk and stumbling toward the door, his legs trembling beneath him. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." But the door slammed shut before he could reach it, the heavy oak panels vibrating as if something massive had struck them from the other side, sealing us within the confines of the study. The windows followed suit, their shutters closing with thunderous crashes that echoed through the house like gunshots, plunging the room into an even deeper darkness. We were sealed in the study together, predator and prey, as the spiritual forces I had awakened prepared to claim their final victim. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began to form on the windows despite the sweltering Louisiana heat outside, creating a surreal and terrifying scene. Master Bogard's breath came in visible puffs as he backed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror as he watched the impossible unfold before him. "You're a witch," he gasped, his voice cracking with fear, his mind struggling to comprehend the forces that were closing in around him. "A devil worshipper. You've sold your soul to dark forces." "I am a mother," I corrected, feeling the power of the ancestors flowing through me like liquid fire, strengthening my resolve and empowering my voice. "A mother whose child was murdered by 13 men who thought themselves above the laws of justice. The spirits I serve are not dark. They are the guardians of the innocent, the protectors of those who cannot protect themselves." The air in the room began to shimmer like heat waves, distorting our vision and creating an ethereal atmosphere, and figures started to materialize in the growing darkness, translucent forms that seemed to be composed of shadow and starlight, their presence both terrifying and majestic. The spirits of the ancestors who had answered my call for justice moved with purpose and dignity, surrounding Master Bogard like judges preparing to pronounce sentence. Among them, I could see the spirit of my grandmother, the original Marie Laveau, who had taught me the arts I had used to craft this revenge. Her eyes burned with righteous fury as she looked upon the man who had murdered her great-grandson, and her voice echoed in the spiritual realm with words of condemnation and judgment. "Claude Bogard," her spirit intoned, the words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating with the power of generations past. "You have spilled innocent blood, have murdered a child for the crime of love, have shown no mercy to those under your power. The time has come for you to face the consequences of your actions." Master Bogard fell to his knees, his body shaking with terror as he found himself surrounded by forces beyond his comprehension or control. He was no longer the master of his domain, but a helpless victim facing the wrath of the ancient spirits. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, his voice breaking with desperation, a pathetic plea for forgiveness. "I'm sorry for what I did to your boy. I was wrong. I was cruel. I was everything you say I was. Please, just let me live. Let me make amends." "Amends?" I asked, my voice carrying the weight of 13 days of accumulated grief and rage, a voice that echoed the pain of a mother who had lost her child. "What amends can bring back my son? What compensation can restore the life you stole from him? You had the power to show mercy when he stood on your gallows, and you chose cruelty instead. Now the spirits will show you the same mercy you showed to Baptiste." The spiritual forces that filled the room began to focus their attention on Master Bogard with increasing intensity, their energy converging on him like a vortex of darkness. I could see the life force beginning to drain from his body, could watch as the years of his existence were drawn away by powers that operated according to laws beyond mortal understanding. But this death would not be quick or merciful. The curse I had crafted was designed to make him suffer as my son had suffered, to force him to experience the terror and helplessness that Baptiste had felt as the rope tightened around his neck. Master Bogard began to age visibly, his hair turning white and falling out, his skin wrinkling and sagging as decades passed in minutes. His body grew frail and weak, his breathing became labored, and his eyes clouded with the approach of death. He was no longer the proud and powerful plantation owner, but a withered husk of a man, stripped of his dignity and facing the inevitable consequences of his actions. "Please," he whispered, his voice now barely audible, a desperate plea lost in the growing darkness. "Make it stop. I can't breathe." "Neither could my son," I replied, feeling no pity for his suffering. His pain was a mere echo of the agony he had inflicted on my child. "Neither could Baptiste, as your rope crushed his throat and stole his life. You showed him no mercy, and you will receive none in return." The spiritual noose that was claiming Master Beauregard's life tightened with each passing moment, cutting off his air supply with the same inexorable certainty that had killed my child. But unlike Baptiste's quick death, this execution would be prolonged, would force the condemned man to experience every moment of terror and despair that comes with the knowledge that death is approaching and cannot be avoided. He gasped and choked, his body convulsing in a desperate attempt to draw breath, but the spiritual forces held him in their grip, denying him the relief of oblivion. As Master Beauregard's life ebbed away, I could feel the presence of my son's spirit joining the ancestors who had gathered to witness this final act of justice. Baptiste appeared to me as he had been in life, young and innocent, full of love and hope despite the circumstances of his birth. His spirit smiled at me with the radiant joy of a child who had finally seen his mother's love vindicated. "Thank you, Mama," his voice whispered in my mind, carrying the warmth and affection that had made his life such a blessing. "Thank you for not letting them get away with what they did to me. Thank you for showing them that even a slave child's life has value, that even the powerless can find ways to strike back against injustice." Master Beauregard's death throes lasted for nearly an hour, his body convulsing as the spiritual forces claimed his life bit by bit, moment by moment. When he finally lay still, his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling as if he could see the judgment that awaited him in whatever realm his soul had been dragged to. The sight of his lifeless body brought a sense of completion, a feeling that justice had finally been served. The spiritual forces that had filled the room began to dissipate, their work complete and their justice satisfied. The temperature returned to normal, the shadows retreated to their natural positions, and the oppressive atmosphere that had marked the presence of the ancestors lifted like fog before the morning sun. I stood alone in the study with the body of the man who had murdered my son, feeling a profound sense of completion settle over me like a benediction. 13 men had condemned Baptiste to death, and 13 men had paid the ultimate price for their crime. The debt of blood had been satisfied, and the spirits of the ancestors could rest knowing that justice had been served. The news of Master Beauregard's death spread quickly through what remained of the plantation's population. But by then, most of the enslaved people had already fled to freedom, understanding that the supernatural events of the past 13 days had effectively destroyed the system that had held them in bondage. The plantation house stood empty except for me and my daughter Celeste, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of the 13 men who had died for their crimes. The fields lay fallow, overgrown with weeds, a testament to the end of an era. The machinery stood idle, rusting in the sun, a symbol of the broken system. And the great house that had once been a symbol of white supremacy and plantation prosperity had become a monument to the terrible price that must be paid when innocent blood is spilled. I remained on the plantation for the rest of my life, not as a slave, but as the guardian of a place where justice had been served and the spirits of the ancestors had demonstrated their power. Visitors occasionally came to see the woman who had cursed an entire plantation, but most stayed away, understanding that some places were too charged with spiritual energy to be safely approached by the uninitiated. The 13 voodoo dolls that had served as the instruments of divine justice were buried beneath the oak tree where my son had been hanged, their work complete and their power spent. But their influence lived on in the stories that spread throughout the South, tales whispered in hushed tones around campfires and in slave quarters. Tales of a mother who had called down the wrath of the ancestors to avenge her murdered child, a woman who had defied the power of the white man and unleashed forces that could not be controlled. 13 dolls, 13 deaths, 13 days became a whispered warning in slave quarters from Virginia to Texas. Don't mess with a voodoo woman's child. Don't spill innocent blood. Don't think that power makes you untouchable. The spirits are watching, and they remember everything. The Civil War came and went, reshaping the landscape of the South and forever altering the lives of its people. Slavery was officially abolished, and the world changed around the abandoned plantation where I lived with the ghosts of 13 souls. They, the perpetrators, were dead men. But I endured, weathered the years, growing old amidst the decaying remnants of the very system that sought to obliterate my family, a living, breathing testament to the enduring truth that some forms of justice soar far beyond the confines of human law, operating on principles as ancient and immutable as the earth itself, predating the dawn of civilization. In 1870, at the venerable age of 63, death came peacefully to me in my sleep, my faithful Celeste by my side. She, bless her unwavering soul, had remained with me through all those long, lonely years, a constant companion in solitude and remembrance. My final words, whispered on the edge of eternity, as recalled by those present, were, "Baptiste, Mama is coming home." The plantation, stained with sorrow and soaked in injustice, was eventually sold and subdivided, parceled out to new owners, new hopes. Yet, the main house, the epicenter of so much pain, remained stubbornly uninhabitable. Every family that dared to cross its threshold, to lay claim to its shadowed rooms, reported the same chilling phenomena, disembodied shadows dancing independently of any earthly source, whispers and sighs emanating from vacant chambers, and a suffocating, ever-present sense of being watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes. Local legend, fueled by fear and whispers, claimed that the tormented spirits of the 13 dead men were trapped within the property lines, condemned to an eternal purgatory, forced to wander the grounds where they had committed their heinous crimes until the very end of time. But those who truly understood the weight of those days, the cosmic balance that had been so brutally disrupted, knew a deeper truth. The entities that haunted the plantation were not the restless souls of the guilty, but rather the vigilant guardians, the ancestral protectors who remained as sentinels, ensuring that such a horrific injustice would never, ever be repeated. The saga of Marie Laveau and her 13 voodoo dolls, crafted with love and imbued with righteous fury, became an integral part of the rich tapestry of African-American folklore, a source of strength and resilience that sustained the community through the arduous years of Reconstruction and far beyond. The story was told and retold countless times, each iteration adding new embellishments, new details that shimmered like moonlight on the Mississippi, while steadfastly preserving the core message that love, in its purest, most unwavering form, is infinitely more powerful than hatred, that justice, though often delayed, will inevitably prevail, and that even the seemingly most powerless individuals can find the means, the courage, the spiritual fortitude to strike back against those who would seek to destroy their families, their heritage, their very souls. This, then, was the story of Marie Laveau, a woman who chose the enduring power of love over the fleeting illusion of submission, the unwavering pursuit of justice over the tempting path of passive acceptance, and the profound strength of her spiritual connection over the superficial allure of earthly power. Her act of supernatural retribution, born of a mother's grief and fueled by ancestral rage, became a potent symbol of hope and resistance for enslaved people throughout the South, a powerful testament to the fact that even the most systematically oppressive systems could not permanently extinguish the sacred bonds between mother and child, nor silence the voices of the ancestors who clamored for justice on behalf of the innocent. The 13 men who so callously murdered my son learned, far too late, that there existed in this world forces far more formidable than whips and chains, more terrifying than any earthly authority, and infinitely more enduring than the oppressive systems they so blindly served. Their gruesome deaths served as a stark and unforgettable warning to all who would dare to harm the innocent, a visceral demonstration that the universe itself, in its vast and intricate design, demands retribution, demands payment in full when children are murdered for the simple, beautiful crime of love. The plantation, which had once stood as a grotesque symbol of white supremacy and the inhumanity of human bondage, was transformed through the alchemy of love and sacrifice into a haunting monument to the indomitable power of maternal love and the unwavering pursuit of spiritual justice. A place where the ancestors had unequivocally demonstrated their ability to reach across the seemingly impenetrable veil between worlds and claim what was rightfully, irrevocably owed to them. My story, the story of Marie Laveau, serves as a timeless reminder that heroism can manifest in countless forms, that sometimes the most effective response to injustice is a willingness to call upon forces that lie far beyond the limited scope of human understanding, and that the love between a mother and her child is, without question, one of the most sacred and unbreakable bonds in the entire universe. A bond so powerful that not even the cold, unforgiving hand of death can sever it. The echoes of my story continue to resonate powerfully today, a persistent reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, that love, in its purest form, possesses the extraordinary power to transcend even death itself, and that those who inflict harm upon the innocent do so at their own immense and potentially eternal peril. My tale serves as a potent illustration that there exist in this world powers far beyond the grasp of human comprehension, forces that operate according to ancient, immutable laws, predating civilization itself and more enduring than any transient earthly authority. In this modern age, where so many individuals feel disempowered and helpless in the face of systematic oppression, my example stands as a beacon of hope, reminding us that there are always resources available to those who possess the knowledge and the courage to access them, that the spiritual realm offers avenues of justice that far surpass the limitations of human law, and that the bonds of love and family remain, and will always remain, among the most potent and transformative forces in the entire universe. If these tales of courage, resilience, and supernatural justice resonate within your heart, I invite you to join our growing community, a dedicated collective committed to preserving the often hidden histories of those who fought back against injustice in all its myriad forms. Subscribe to our chronicles to discover more untold accounts of spiritual resistance and divine retribution from throughout history, and share your invaluable thoughts and perspectives on how these powerful narratives continue to shape our understanding of justice, family, and the profound, often mysterious forces that shape our world. These stories matter, not merely as dry historical accounts, but as potent reminders that love, in its purest and most unwavering form, truly does conquer all, that justice, though often elusive, will ultimately prevail, and that the universe itself, in its infinite wisdom and boundless compassion, stands firmly with those who protect the innocent against those who would seek to do them harm.